So thanks to everyone again for joining us today. I am Jazz Flaw, one of the co-conveners of the Health Thematic Group. I'm joining the symposium today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors past and present from the lands on which you are all located. I am extremely pleased to introduce our very first keynote speaker for this symposium, Professor Simone Fullagar from Griffith University. Her keynote is titled Health Matters as Affective Entanglements, Exploring more than human bodies through post-qualitative research. Simone is an interdisciplinary health sociologist. She has published widely on the politics of embodiment, material feminisms, and post-qualitative research across health, mental health, and physical culture. Her latest co-authored books include the wonderfully thought-provoking Feminism and a Vital Politics of Depression and Recovery, published with Palgrave, which personally has greatly shaped my research, and the forthcoming A Glossary for Doing Post-Qualitative, New Materialist, and Critical Posthumanist Research Across Disciplines, also with Routledge, and coming out next year. For the attendees, I'll be chairing this session, so feel free to type your questions in the chat, and I'll pass them on to Simone after the presentation, or of course you can raise your hand, but please bear with me, this is my first time chairing on Zoom. I will do my best, and it might not be great. Simone, you'll speak for a total of 40 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left. I'll try to be as gentle as possible. And yeah, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jazz. It's great to be here, and thank you to Matt, who is going to share my slides. So let's see if we can get this team effort working. Fantastic. I don't have a lot of slides, so hopefully this will work. Excellent. So I would like to thank very much the conveners of both thematic groups for inviting me to give this keynote. For me, that's a very exciting convergence, emotions and affect, and health, mental health. I also do sport research, but it's not really going to figure much in today's talk, but it's a wonderful combination. So if you could move to the next slide, please. I would like to say Jingiri and acknowledge the Yugambeh and Kumba Meri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the unceded land upon which I live and work, and pay respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I would also, in a post-humanist spirit, like to acknowledge the wildlife kin that you can see on that slide, plants and other humans that co-constitute the material conditions for living and working, where I am in the Currumbin Eco Village down on the border of Queensland and New South Wales, and also on the Gold Coast campus of Griffith University. The photo that you see there is a picture of the pandemic traffic on the bridge during lockdown. So the kangaroos were certainly taking over. Next slide, please. It's been actually quite challenging to prepare this keynote today and really think about hope and empathy in these uncertain times, given the sense of exhaustion and overwhelm that many people are feeling at this moment, myself included at times. Although I do acknowledge my privileged position as a white settler and a senior academic with a continuing position, whatever that means these days, and living in Queensland, which is a state that's had far less COVID impact to date, though that is about to change very soon. So within this pandemic life has become a kind of maze which requires a continual exertion of emotional labour to navigate an array of paths and distressing dead ends that are the institutional demands of work, unemployment, political inaction, disrupted intimate relationships of home and public life that are very much entangled with the complex affective intensities, sadness, hopelessness, rage, grief, and also at times joy, love and connection. There is so much to say about this contemporary moment, and also limits as to what is sayable as it unfolds in our experience. So I appreciate this opportunity for us to come together and share insights and generate different ways of knowing and doing and becoming sociologists in the post-COVID world. So in this talk, I want to engage with some of the current debates across post-qualitative inquiry, feminist new materialisms, decolonising, post-humanist and queer theories that are, concerned in different ways with how our biosocial relations come to matter in relation to health and wellbeing. However, theories that pursue materiality and ontology are not entirely new. Of course, Indigenous cosmologies are an example of knowledge practices that do not rest upon Western traditions of binary thinking, that value culture, mind, the social over and inferiorise nature, body, biology as human-centred, racialised, sex-gendered hierarchies. So over a number of decades, explorations of these more than human worlds, material discursive relations and embodied effects have really contributed to a range of intense debates about the politics of knowing, doing and representing. And these affective intensities are not particularly new, because when I was doing my PhD as a student in the 90s, this was amidst the theory wars that were actually playing out in Sydney at the time. And they were somewhat irreconcilable at the University of New South Wales. And for 3 years, our sociology department split into 2 sociology departments. We had the traditionalists defending their founding fathers and the post-structuralists pushing materialism further through feminist theories of the body. And I think that situation is completely unimaginable now, and any kind of divided department will probably just simply be restructured out of existence for being far too problematic. So more recently, we've seen concerns raised again and explored in the British Journal of Sociology by Fitzgerald, Rose and Singh, who've expressed dissatisfaction with the limits of a sociological imagination that tends to kind of bracket out questions of the biosocial formation of life and health. And they are calling for new styles of thought to address the complexity of social problems that require an understanding of how our social, cultural and our natural worlds are co-implicated. So how can social life and health be researched without ignoring the biological and the non-human nature as some kind of pre-social substratum of existence? Seeing a diverse range of perspectives contributing to these debates in mainstream sociology journals and beyond certainly gives me hope. I would like to mention that there will be further contributions from an Australian perspective through a new special issue that's about to come out. It's coming out slowly online, of the Health Sociology Review on post-human perspectives on health. That's co-edited by Kim McLeod at the University of Tasmania and myself. And it's fantastic that we have a number of contributing authors who are here, some of whom are presenting their work from this special issue at this symposium. And as the lead author of our introductory piece for the issue, Kim has really sought to engage with the critiques of post-humanism raised by Indigenous scholars, and we've explored the complexities involved with refiguring the human in ways that acknowledge the affective forces of power and generative potential of alternative knowledges. So I really encourage you to have a look at that special issue, as it's just coming out now online first. So today I want to consider how these debates open up possibilities for an affective sociology that is very much attuned to the material discursive conditions that constitute health, illness and well-being as embodied experiences. And in particular, I'll focus on the gendered body-mind experiences by drawing on the book that Jazz mentioned that I published with Wendy O'Brien and Adele Pavlidis, the Feminism and a Vital Politics of Depression and Recovery, and try and forge some connections with the impacts of COVID. This is a hopeful sociological orientation that is about attuning to the affective contours of everyday life, fears and worry, anger, sadness, joy, belonging, that often remain unintelligible or difficult to articulate as personal and political formations. So in this sense, our present challenges, COVID as it exacerbates inequality, climate change, and my particular interest in rising rates of mental health issues and distress, are also haunted by historical forces, the violence of colonisation, north-south inequality, the trauma of various forms of injustice, the tentacles of neoliberalism, heteropatriarchy and extractive capitalism. And at the same time, there exists the possibility and responsibility of imagining different futures with greater social and ecological justice. It is in the face of these entangled time-space matters, Karen Barad would refer to them as, that collaborative academic work is a really important site of affective intensities that generate different ways of thinking and feeling our way through. And certainly something that keeps me going as I work with colleagues to co-create different kinds of worlding practices for doing sociology. So Karen Barad, as a quantum physicist, queer and feminist theorist, talks about the past, present and future, not in a relation of linear unfolding, but threaded through one another in a non-linear enfolding of space-time mattering. So many questions about our shifting space-time, our notions of temporality are being provoked by the COVID situation. And speaking of this past, present, future relation, I want to return to a moment of a public and personal experience that occurred now 20 years ago, the significant global event that was 9/11, as it certainly resonates with me now. In 2001, I was about to give my first public lecture as an early career academic at Charles Sturt University in Albury, rural New South Wales, to talk about my ARC project on youth suicide and the dynamics of shame in rural communities. Everything had been organised with about 80 people planning to come from all the surrounding rural communities, families, health workers, advocates. And the night before, the plane struck the Twin Towers and our world changed. We deliberated about what to do in this situation. Should we go ahead or cancel at the last minute? How would the shock and trauma of such a highly mediated global event intersect with the affective intensity of talking about the personal matter of suicide? It felt like a really risky, intense sociological dilemma and decision. And my gut feminist response, and that of my head of school at the time, was to say, let's go ahead with the forum that evening to offer a public space for people to come together. And to our surprise, we did have a full house that night. And I felt like I was enacting a public sociology of hope and empathy in uncertain times, as people stayed on afterwards and continued to talk about matters of living and dying. As a young sociologist, I found it a profoundly moving occasion, a kind of liminal space of doing sociology to explore the complex emotional responses to very public and very private experiences. And 20 years later, these similar affective forces continue to play out in very different contexts, and they compel me to understand as a researcher how I'm entangled with the dynamics of our social worlds. So I'm interested in how an affective sociology works with the tensions, incompatible logics and contradictory forces of fear, loss and joy and connection as part of an assemblage formation of everyday life. The intellectual resources of feminist materialisms and posthumanisms have certainly oriented my thinking around both moments of affirmation and moments of dissonance. Disturbing effects are also countered by connection and belonging and hopefulness, and they emanate from a range of creative, embodied, digitally mediated moments that trouble these arbitrary divisions between private and public, home and work, digital and physical, human and non-human, self and other. The post-COVID world is reconfiguring the space-time mattering of everyday lives. Social worlds are saturated with the affective intensities of a relentless corona news cycle that permeate and disrupt living rooms and digital devices. And these words and images of sickness, of graphs of infection, vaccination rates, do not simply represent an external world out there. They materialise digitally through an affective economy that circulates fear, anger, loss, frustration, political inaction. Next slide, please. So informed by the philosophical work of Spinoza, particularly the work on sad and joyful effects, and Deleuze and Guattari, affect scholars, and we have a fantastic range of affect scholars in Australia, Anna Hickey Moody and Buchanan, Kim McLeod, Cameron Duff, and others, They help us move beyond thinking of emotion as codified or simply feelings, personalized feelings, to really consider the affective forces that have a transversal capacity. Human and non-human bodies, objects, entities are affected and also affect in ways that transform capacities. So the coronavirus exerts its more than human force via the socio-political flows that shape the capacities of individuals and nations to respond in very unequal ways. And the transversal flows are also evident in the alliances forged through digital networks of right-wing advocates of individual freedom, anti-vax, alternative health and religious spiritual movements. So Brian Masumi argues that being affected and affecting are therefore two sides of the same dynamic change, and hence affect does not reside in a subject, body or sign as if it were an object possessed by a subject. Sociological notions of agency and structure are profoundly reconfigured through this multi-scalar emphasis on relations, forces of desire and productive power that materialise through the assemblage formations of health, illness and well-being. So how does hope come to matter and empathy come to matter? I'm going to focus a little more on hope in this talk. I want to start by troubling how hope is often mobilised and framed as a humanist concept within the context of capitalist logics and flows. This is not a question about what hope is, but rather what hope does in terms of material discursive formation and effects. Drawing the work of feminists such as Rosie Braidotti and others, we can think of hope as a profoundly effective, imagined relation, an aspiration and desire that embodies a certain ethos and logic. Hope is an imaginative, generative force that seeks future change, outcomes, objects, or experiences of some kind. Feeling hopeful provides some reprieve against the heavy weight of dread, despair, and the distress of being trapped in present circumstances. Hope is transversal. It travels across and connects bodies, lives, and beliefs to form collectivized imaginings that can move in very different ways. So back in 2002, almost 20 years ago again, I bought this amazing book. I really recommend it. It is a collection of essays edited by Mary Zunazi, and it's called Hope, New Philosophies for Change. And in it, she interviews a range of leading academics, including Masumi, Chris Davis, Spivak and others. And this book has travelled with me all these years. I've moved around Australia and to the UK and back. It's an example of a material object that resonates, and reading it enacts a hope in faith, hopefulness, a faith in theories that can help us craft hopeful conversations about what is possible. Zunazi talks about hope as not simply the desire for things to come or the betterment of life. It is the drive or energy that embeds us in the world, in the ecology of life, ethics and politics. Hope is an effective energy that mobilises individual and collective bodies and capacities in ways that can have constructive and destructive effects on the self, the social and the ecological. We can ask, how is hope deployed within the particular power relations and normative logics? And how does hope materialise through embodied practices and assemblage relations to generate transformative capacities? Within contemporary neoliberalism, hope is captured within the logics of individualism, normalisation, consumption and techno fixes. You know, for example, vaccines will eventually enable a return to normal life after COVID. Climate change can be solved by improved technologies, with little regard to inequalities, trauma and more than human nature. And mental ill health will be solved by biomedical and psi interventions, whether that's medication, ECT or CBT or another kind of acronym. Leading effect theorist Lauren Berlant, who sadly died earlier this year, has theorised effect in terms of how normative hopes and desires figure as a form of cruel optimism. Entangled with the socio-cultural and political and economic processes, hope keeps subjects tied to practices of living, beliefs in individual happiness, for example, that participate in the conditions that create unhappiness. For example, the prospect of class mobility, romantic narrative, normalcy, nationality or better sexual identity. We see this play out through neoliberal logics in positive thinking, self-care and well-being, where affect becomes reduced to a psychological notion of emotion that exists primarily within an agentic self. And I'll return to this question about the effects of cruel optimism as I share some of our research on recovery and what happens when the hopeful orientation of biomedicine fails in its promise to alleviate distress. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about the book and the research that informed it. Across many national surveys, we see that women repeatedly report higher rates of distress than men. It's depression, anxiety, self-harm, body dissatisfaction, suicide attempts rather than completions, and eating disorders. And this has continued to be exacerbated by COVID-19, particularly among young people, young women. And while gender is acknowledged as a variable in population health statistics, it's largely ignored as an analytic category that warrants deeper investigation. So the rise of common mental health disorders is largely framed in terms of affective or cognitive problems of mind or brain that can be remedied through recovery-oriented behavioural, psychopharmacological or lifestyle interventions, or all of the above. So advances in neuroscience, psychiatry, clinical psychology, psychopharmacology and digital health technologies all play a significant role in materialising gendered knowledge about the complex, invisible and immaterial dimensions of mental health or emotional distress in our society. And what is often absent in public discourse about tackling depression or anxiety are the insights of feminist researchers who identify the contextual relationships between women's emotional lives, the politics of mental health diagnosis, and various forms of discrimination, inequity, and violence. At stake in these discourses pre and post-COVID is the issue of how women's experiences of mental health come to be culturally imagined and felt as personal troubles, rather than as public feelings, Kertovich's work, that are deeply entwined with historical, cultural, economic, and political conditions. When gender is acknowledged in mental health policies, professional practices, and biopsychosocial research, it most often figures as a static binary category of identity, emphasising or defaulting to the sameness of all women, which is really a kind of white, middle-class, heteronormative, cisgendered figure, and difference from men. This ignores institutional practices and cultural contexts and effective relations that shape the diversity of women's lives. And COVID has opened up public discussion about mental health as a social issue, as well as recognising the gendered impacts and inequities of the pandemic. However, there is still an enormous amount of work to be doing to shift these assumptions. Next slide, please. So stepping back from the diagnostic authority that so commonly shapes public and personal knowledge of mental ill health, our research considers how body experiences of distress, thoughts, feelings and actions are imbricated in depression as an organising device. The classification of different types of depression within diagnostic cultures is very much tied to the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, American Psychiatric Association, promises a sense of certainty and legitimacy experienced as illness that stands against often uncertain, frightening and overwhelming affects, symptoms, life histories and events that individuals are supposed to recover from. However, theorising this as medicalisation was not our departure point. We sought to think through the visceral materiality of depression and recovery as a knotty problem, where the rhizomatic movement of bad feelings produces disruptive effects and affects in women's everyday lives. So knots of bad feelings turn stomachs, muscles tense into balls of sinew, repetitive thoughts twist together as gendered self-world interactions tighten entangled threads of affect that are experienced individually and collectively. Thinking beyond the atomistic individual mind as a location of depression, we draw upon Erin Manning's Deleuzian work to orient us towards the directional forces through which a certain knot of tendencies begin to tie themselves together. This knot is the bodying. So bodying enacts the movement of depression recovery as event rather than simply individualized experience and its humanist baggage around agency. As a means of foregrounding the affective relations and interactions that constitute subjectivity in multiple ways. As Barad points out, interactions are practices of making a difference, of cutting together apart, entangling, differentiating as one move in the making of phenomena. Next slide, please. With respect to this entanglement with depression, we ask how recovery as a transformative process is rendered intelligible through the material, affective and discursive relations of everyday life. How does gender come to matter through women's thoughts, feelings and actions that are entangled with disruptive effects and flows? Through a post-qualitative approach, we have traced the affective movement of the self and bad feelings through recovery and depression as an enactment of these multiple self-world relations. Through an ARC project that involved 80 women, self-identified women who came forward in terms of how they defined recovery themselves. And they didn't require a diagnosis, but over 80% of them had been diagnosed by a GP. And this was across the life course. Embracing an experimental ethos through mangling our data and our theoretical analysis as writing agitating. This involved the enactment of different ways of writing, from found poems that we reworked with a more post-humanist theorising, Richardson's earlier work, through memos, blog posts and screenplays. We sought to write through this different approach to evoke affective intensities and material relations of recovery, rather than simply represent a generalised truth of women's lives. While we avoid positioning women's stories as unmediated sources of truth about recovery or romanticise their efforts as evidence of feminist resistance, we want to stay with the trouble at the heart of feminist research and problematise any division between kind of personal, political experience and cultural production. And we acknowledge the workings of our privilege, our whiteness, for example, and the limits of any definitive claim to know. A more performative orientation to writing through a poetics of recovery emphasises the disruptions to rhythm, discord, and patterns that articulate how differences are produced in relation to gendered subjectivity, rather than simply arising from a unified, authentic notion of voice. So like Barad, we found ourselves drawn to poetics as a mode of expression, not in order to move away from thinking rigorously, but on the contrary, to lure us towards the possibilities of engaging the force of imagination in its materiality. I want to turn to an example of gender performativity in relation to hormonal interactions and the undoing of recovery. 28 women spoke voluntarily about their experience of hormones, the entanglement of hormones in their recovery and depression life. And this was related to the embodied events that occurred through the context of the life course, which we problematise as a kind of linear construction. And so this notion of hormones was explored and talked about in relation to puberty, younger women, pregnancy, birth, and also menopause or perimenopause as key transition points. The large body of scientific research out there on hormones has often diverse and competing causal hypotheses and results. It evokes women's hormones as biochemical substances that exert causal or associative influence that increases women's risk of depression. So we have, as sociologists, we would say this is a kind of essentialist discourse, reducing women to their hormones. And as feminists, we say there's a long history of hysteria through which these ideas have materialised. And in her work, Celia Roberts argues that the brain and the nervous system in the endocrine system is significant for analysis of the social, as it's via the nervous system that information about the external world and other factors can influence the endocrine system. So rather than unpacking that in detail, I'm actually going to read to you Pam, a poem that we put together around Pam's experience. Pam was 44 at the time of the interview, white, middle class, Anglican, quite religious in her identification, a heterosexual married mother. At the time we spoke with her, she talked about the repeated experiences of depression and throughout her life, and she rejected the term recovery. When I'm not coping with things, I happen to become depressed. It's both a personality thing and it's a biological thing. I consider the term recovery. I would reject it, in fact, from my own path. Recovery makes it sound like you're never going to have to deal with it again. And look, shit happens. Yeah, life's going pretty good at the moment. But another day I'm going to wake up in the morning and think, bugger, I don't want to get out of bed, laughing. Whatever's going on, it's just too yuck. I want it to go away. The really good thing is that it will go away. In my experience, it's learning how to live. Live with what you've got, live with what comes my way. My experience of depression have revolved quite heavily around hormones, one way or another. The first time I was really aware of being depressed was in puberty, probably on and off from about 13 to 18 years old. In 1974, my parents' house was flooded. Mum wasn't coping very well. She makes everyone feel comfortable. As long as everyone around is comfortable, she copes. My body was changing. There were expectations to fit in from girls at school. I resisted right from the word go. I didn't cope very well in my teenage years. I felt tight in the guts. I slept poorly, dreamt bizarrely. At 18, I was thinking, who the hell am I? Trying to establish myself in a work life, finding out who I was as a person. It was very difficult to express your spiritual life, to stand up to chaps who were so convinced that they were absolutely right about God. Women should keep their places and all that bullshit. When I married, I went from being an independent, very unpregnant woman working for good money to someone who's new in town, feeling rather like a ship in full sail. I was so bored out of my scone. I've never felt as isolated since then. It was highly emotional stuff and the hormones completely disruptive. I was terrified they'd take the baby away from me. I think it just passed with the hormones. I did start to relax a little more. I didn't have that death grip. The fear didn't turn up quite so often. I fell pregnant again and the happy hormones kicked in. Then I lost the baby. It's like I'm wading through syrup just to get through a day. It's hard to tell, to differentiate between self, inside, outside. I'm crying at the GPs. Next he's writing out these antidepressants. One dose and I felt kind of dislocated from myself. I lied to him and stopped taking them. He was absolutely no help at all. I found out about postnatal depression by reading. We moved again and I got involved in another community. They're very open and welcoming. A big part of getting better, I think. I've done the postnatal thing, so now guess what? It's menopause. I ask myself now, are you particularly unhappy about something in your life? Are you fed up of being treated this way or that way? What's your body telling you about what hormones are doing at the moment? My life would have been very, very different if I had realised that I could actively dream about my own life at school and imagine what that might be like. We expect the mother identity in women to take care of everyone and everything before themselves. The uncertainty of depression and its recurrence continues to refigure the movement of recovery beyond a return to normality. Pam rejects the word recovery as a broken promise. She echoes the recovery in the bin activists who claim the term unrecovered as a way of rejecting the normative pressure to recover. Her words evoke multiple temporalities, including a more desirable future that she imagined by occupying the past present as a schoolgirl. Pasts and presents and futures are wrapped up in embodied and effective processes of learning how to respond to the multiple demands of caring for others and oneself, mediated, of course, through the imagined heterosexual feminine futures that Lauren Berlant ties to cruel optimism. Hence, the complex, effective relations of recovery cannot be grasped as a linear process that is premised upon static notions of past embodiment, self-management in the present, and future desires that will naturally unfold. To manage the recurrence of depression in her life at that moment, Pam enacts a new habit of questioning how the feminine self is acted upon by gendered forces, hormones, emotions, relationships with men, organisation, childcare, and identity formation. as she seeks out other capacities to act that sustain her inside-outside self-world connection. And she talked about study, her garden, nature, exercise, companionship with friends, family, refusing consumerist lifestyles, a sense of spirituality beyond religion. The entangled performativity of gender and depression in Pam's account diffracts the privileged certainty of biology and personality as primary causal factors. It invites a reading of the biopsychosocial threads that knot together the uncertain effects: fear, despair, boredom, loneliness, worthlessness, self-sacrifice, care, responsibility, by the gender conditions of possibility that shape the habits of coping, feeling, and questioning gendered norms. Moving beyond the biology, culture, structure, agency impasse has led us to think through biopsychosocialities as a vital feminist politics that reconfigures recovery as a matter of aliveness, as enacted in ways that are temporarily emergent through relations with particular non-human places and social practices.
5 minutes left, Simone.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Doing exercise, sport, tinkering with medication, narrating hope and despair, gardens, women's centres, changing work and care for others. The agentic possibilities of entanglements are significant in terms of what non-human capacities can do to enable different practices and habits. And Carolyn Pedwell's work on affective dynamics of habit also connects with what can spark mind-body change, with accounts of the material processes and infrastructures through which a change might endure. So Pam talked about enacting habits that sustained her well-being through more than human relations with gardens and gyms. She said, it was more a matter of how I learnt to live with what happens to me. I've actually joined a gym recently, and that was a big joke because I'm the least sporty person you could possibly imagine. And the opportunity arose with a moment's notice. I went down and signed on with my neighbour. She had a skiing trip to prepare for, didn't want to come back all busted and broken. And now I'm actually going more than she is. It's quite bizarre. So I think this little snippet is an example of how the affective moment of shifting people's relation with themselves can come in very unexpected ways. So I want to finish with a final poem, which I think is a very different kind of orientation. And it's one that came out of the interview we had with India, who's a 24-year-old woman of colour who was adopted by a white Australian family as a child. And it's called Fishing and a Feminist Politics of Care. I lost my identity when I went through my depression. I had a really hard time in a job I loved in the fishing industry. I was the only girl in the storeroom, getting pushed around, bullied, sexually harassed. My team leader felt threatened. I could do what he could do. None of my supervisors would do anything about it. It was so hard being a woman in that environment. I left, just stayed silent for about 6 months. I didn't want to go out of the house. I didn't have any motivation. I didn't feel like there was any goodness anywhere. I didn't realise what was happening to me. It took over my life. I was so enclosed. I couldn't keep living like that anymore. I couldn't keep silent anymore. I've had things happen in my life. I had an awesome GP who helped. Centrelink helped when I left work. The medical certificate meant I could pay the bills and work on the depression. Recovery is healing. It's like having a job, it's 24 hours a day. It's not about forgetting what's happened to you. It was really important to be surrounded by women. It's another world for me, in a place where I felt safe emotionally, mentally, physically. I was very lucky to participate in groups with other young women at a young women's place. They just offer different kinds of support. I did a self-esteem course, self-defense course, communication, relationships course. What I needed was just a woman to talk to. Some people put kind of negative stuff on you. Oh, why are you getting counselling? Why can't you work it out for yourself? It opened some doors for me to be able to deal with other stuff that was unresolved, like wanting approval and affection, and all that stuff that I never got from my adopted family. And I was always thinking, oh, if I can do more, if I can just do this, then maybe it'll happen. I was sexually abused when I was 7. I wasn't allowed to express how I felt. So therefore I was not important. I moved out of home when I was 16. Sex at a young age, drugs, alcohol. I was expected to be passive. I was expected to be polite. I was expected to do the right thing, to put someone else's needs in front of me and wait for other people to go, and then I'm allowed to go. I gave myself permission to feel angry, sad, and feel those things. I'm learning about my own boundaries. When you're passive, it's easy to just move the line a bit to let somebody else have what they want. You have to learn to move that line a bit the other way. The only way I could do that was slowly work through it by asking, what's happening to me? What am I feeling? Why do I feel like this? All those things that gave me space to be able to think for myself. It's okay to say, I don't want to do that. I have huge motivation, hope, and I still love fishing. I have this just magical connection with water and fish and all the boat stuff that goes with it. When I go fishing, it's quite tiring lugging our stuff with the car, but it's relaxing, sitting by the water, listening, looking. It's exciting when you catch a fish. It's awesome. I didn't think that I'd have that when I would be in a very different place. The service was crucial. It was like another family. You're not restricted, you're not obligated, you're not expected. We have those good fun things, bike riding, swimming, fishing. You can do them with other women to let stuff go for a few hours. The good stuff in the end helped me. I went to my first Reclaim the Night march on Friday, surrounded by women speaking out about violence. Even though we're entitled to our rights, there's still a long way to go to actually have them. And on that note, I'm going to stop there because I think there's many more things we can talk about in the discussion about what recovery means in the COVID moment. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Simone. I feel like everybody's probably clapping at their respective locations at the moment. Also, I do feel like the word visceral is really quite appropriate for the personal reflections that you've shared from your participants. That was really lovely. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. And I'm just trying to see if I can see some raised hands. There's so many attendees in front of me. I don't want to miss anyone. Okay, no raised hands yet. Okay. Simone, I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about, invite you over to talk a little bit about some of your other work that is connected to what you're doing now on the digitization of mental health care. Because I feel like quite a lot of the things you've mentioned, so things like relying on hormonal explanations for mental illness, or trying to understand the nervous system as the location where mental illness is, has been also translated into all sorts of apps that people are using. Certainly some of the people I speak to in my research talk about that, and they find it quite useful in many ways to understand their mental illness through data where the algorithm is really coding the language of the DSM overwhelmingly into the app. Of course, a lot of them are critical as well. I was wondering if you can kind of, reflect on this moment we're in, because in many ways, COVID-19 has accelerated that quite massively, and a lot of psychiatrists that are quite high profile in the US are pushing things like computational psychiatry, sharing of mental illness data across borders. And I was wondering what your reflection on that would be.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's a really complicated one. And I think I would start by saying that I think as sociologists, we need to think critically about the assumption that just more talk about mental health will fix the problem, will address stigma, everyone will develop increased mental health literacy and know how to get the right help to solve the problems. As we know, the actual discourses, the material discursive interactions that are happening through these mediated apps, and they're very personal when it's on your phone or in a therapeutic encounter, they are constituting the ways in which we understand distress in very particular forms. So I think we're seeing the codification of distress through the biomedical language, and particularly with brain science now. And that's become a very popular way of explaining dysfunction and disorder. So we are at a crucial time where it's fantastic we're talking more about stress, that mental health is getting more attention in policy and funding. But the question is, what does that look like? And how is it materializing through the kinds of assemblages through which technology is a big part? And I'm sure there are other people here who are doing some of that research around the digital context through which that's materializing. And it is concerning because it is fundamentally shifting the language and the materiality of language, as well as the habits and practices that that constitute us, that enfold into our subjectivities. So we need to have these more critical, diverse conversations about, let's go back to what is distress? How is it shaped? I think that's so important. But having the space to do that is quite challenging in the public sphere.
Definitely. Thanks, Simone. And I think a lot of the language from corporations that produce these apps is also about, things like empowerment, but it's really empowerment through reaffirming medicalization through the algorithm. I see that Emma has her hand raised. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Simone. That was absolutely fantastic. Really appreciate your work. I'm curious about, you mentioned, I guess, the transformative possibilities of the methodology in inviting creativity. And I'm interested in, I guess, change and transformation in participants' lives and researchers' lives as a result of using these approaches. And I guess, opening up space outside of the, such dominant biomedical understandings of distress.
Thanks, Emma, and I am a big fan of your work as well as Jazz's work, so it's great to see you here. I think I didn't get time to talk about the work I've been doing subsequent to that book, but I've been doing more with different kinds of creative methods. For example, using body mapping to explore affective experiences in relation to movement. And most recently, at the moment, I'm working with Adele Pavlidis and Holly Thorpe and Deborah Lupton and a few others to look at time capsules and the experience of COVID-19, and particularly around sport, physical activity with a gender perspective, both women who work in it and experience it, including teenagers. So those methods of actually finding creative forms of engagement are really productive and go in all kinds of directions that we don't expect. And so I think in terms of doing COVID research, it is very difficult to sit down with teenagers, for example, and do an interview or even a focus group. But actually we've found using drawing and arts-based methods to be really helpful in creating a space for different kinds of dialogue and to help articulate those kind of nascent ideas and emergent feelings, and to do it collectively too, because those ideas, the transversal notion of affect, moving between all of us, we are affected as researchers, and the young women in that context were very much able to talk about things that they hadn't really thought through. They hadn't been able to kind of create some language to articulate their experiences. So I think that there's so much potential for exploring the complexities of experience and then thinking about the challenge of knowledge translation back into different policy and professional contexts, because that is a real challenge in itself. And I think of the great work that Catherine Boydell and Jill Bennett have been doing around big anxiety projects and really big public arts-oriented work, as well as more work with service providers, because it's how you bridge that divide and open up the tensions as a productive conversation. And that, I think, can occur around the notion of experience, what we mean by lived experience, because I think anyone working in mental health now, however biomedically oriented they are, recognises the importance of understanding lived experience. But I think it's an ongoing challenge, that's for sure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Simone. I don't think there are any other raised hands. No? Yeah, Monica?
Thanks. I'll just unmute as well. Hi, Simone. That was really, really, really interesting and really thought-provoking. I'm really interested if you could say a bit more about how emotions and affect are like collective experiences rather than just individual, or if, I don't know, maybe if that's relevant. I sort of noticed that your stories about recovery of the participants in your research involve change alongside and in relation to other people. And I'm thinking about how there's sort of group work, I guess, that people can get involved with, but what's the importance of other sort of non-medical collectives that people might be involved in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have a couple of chapters exploring both creativity and active embodiment as sites for sites through which women develop different relationships with their bodies and self-world relationships, and that the affective moments of those connections can move them in ways they didn't anticipate. So there's a little glimpse of that in Pam's story about going to the gym. She would never have gone, didn't logically think that the gym was a place for her and to improve her mental health. But once she went, the embodied experience of it and the actual relation, the kind of human, non-human dimension, was something that really engaged her. We heard those kinds of stories many times over, and it made us step back and think about, right, in writing the book, we have to acknowledge that there is a very strong cover story about depression and recovery, which is the biomedical story. It's a normalized way of talking about recovery. Once we got beyond that, we started to open up lots of different experiences, you know, everything from singing in choirs where the collective resonance of voice and bodies coming together was extremely powerful. So that sense of belonging, connection, and it was often non-human as well, which is why gardens kept coming up and plants and nature. And I think that's certainly something we're hearing more about in COVID times. You know, the rates of bird watching have gone through the roof with COVID. So, you know, there's different kinds of relations that aren't always recognised by biomedicine in terms of their transformative potential. Now, this raises the bigger social question of how do we fund them? How do we support them? How do we make these connections visible and valued and not simply see them as activities one does? So I think there's a lot there to think about in terms of the transversal nature of affect and how do we create those welcoming, inclusive, gender sensitive environments and spaces, because we haven't always thought about mind and body together, or reason and emotion together. And once we start doing that, that's a different conversation with local councils and the way they landscape places, gyms, sport organisations. So that's something I'm kind of doing more now in terms of sport and physical activity. So great question, thank you.
Thanks, Simone. Such an interesting discussion. Anyone else? Yes, Ashley?
Hi all, and thanks again, Simone. That was wonderful delivery of your speech, the keynote. I come from a psychology and sociology background, so I love this stuff. I find it absolutely fascinating. And I'm really drawn to feminist new materialism, I think, because to me, it seems to offer an opportunity to bridge that constructed divide between disciplines like sociology and psychology. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, like, do you think that there's a place for some of the discoveries of, you know, neuroscience and psychological science? Is there a place for those discoveries in questions about, you know, what mental distress does in people's, you know, the events of mental distress and stuff like that? Can those things from neuroscience, from psychology, help us talk about them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and quite a provocative one to us sociologists, I think. And certainly something that Nicholas Rose has been working on from a governmentality perspective. I think the one way I would respond to that is to say that our brains are involved in everything we do. That is not the point of contention. I think the point of contention is that there is so much funding that goes into brain science research, and it becomes so normalized that it becomes the singular way of approaching a very complex problem, and it brackets out the social. You know, we're all familiar with that argument. So the challenge is, how do we think about the biopsychosocialities that shape these experiences and have that conversation as a social problem or social issue to be addressed, and bring together different disciplines. But at the same time, the challenge is acknowledging the hierarchical power relations between the sciences and social sciences to start with. I mean, they get an enormous amount of money to do this research. Imagine what we could do as sociologists and psychologists if we had the kind of funding they get. So there are some really, you know, entrenched systematic issues there. But I think opening up transdisciplinary dialogue is a really productive way forward, and finding the people who are interested in doing that. Otherwise, we do remain in a kind of polarized position. And there are some, you know, some fantastic psychologists out there doing all kinds of work in the narrative space as well, who really draw on critical ideas, and also art therapy. So, you know, there's some contested tensions, contested knowledges within psychology and then across. So I think it would be really interesting to have more of these inter or transdisciplinary type conversations and conferences to explore these issues, so that also the scientists can hear what are the cultural contexts and relations, because they don't have the language for it. So we can't simply just dismiss them. I think we have to also think about how we can bring them along and educate them and connect. So great question.
Yeah, so true. And you know, the language of psychology and neuroscience is so much part of how people talk about their states of mental health and illness in the everyday as well. And change the language too, like appropriate it and make it quite malleable. The way people talk about diagnosis, for instance, is always very interesting. Natalie, dear colleague, has a question.
Sorry that I'm not turning on my camera because I'm in my pajamas. COVID times. I was just reflecting on some of the discussion about, you know, where is the role of groups and relationality and nature and activities in this. And I was just thinking about histories of service provision in relation to mental health. So sort of that early 90s community mental health services that were very much attached to local government areas, and the GP would be able to ring the psychiatrist and know who they were. And all of those sort of small group work settings that were available, and then they sort of disappeared over time as funding had sort of stopped. And I recall talking to someone about the value of working with their social worker, and they got them into all of this stuff. And that was kind of bread and butter, at least in some of the historical data about, you know, what people were doing in terms of what constitutes mental health care. And I was just wondering if people in the research you're working with reflected on the changes of what constituted care or treatment, because that seems to have disappeared. Like if you said, do any of the hospitals run groups where people are sharing their experiences, they've all cut that back. There is no such thing as that unless you want to pay a lot of money to do a women's wellness circle and, you know, some stuff with essential oils. So I'm wondering about almost these kind of loops we go in as to what is mental health care, and that the kinds of things you're talking about now about brains, medication, technology, again, arrays that we have been doing some of these things over time. Like, you know, community gardens is a space for people as they're coming out of hospital or institutional care in the 80s and 90s too.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. That's a great question. And it takes me right back to when my first job, when I was a PhD student, was working in community services with people with disabilities and mental health challenges who were moving out of institutions. And the Richmond report was really significant in New South Wales at that time. And there was a lot of innovative practice, and there was a more holistic view of how people, how their wellbeing could be supported, and a lived experience approach. I think this is kind of shifts and moves around, but certainly we've seen, you know, the intensification of neoliberal logics around recovery and pushing people out of services. But I also think we're coming back around again, and we're seeing different kinds of approaches being funded and explored, and it's probably quite different across Australia. That do draw on community-based services and think about links with hospitals, but it's a really, I think, underfunded and under-recognised area. And often the funding goes to mental health organisations who have traditionally provided have a clinical gaze on things. And if I think about Headspace as an example, it's getting a lot of funding. They do have a social recovery pillar in their plan, and they are doing more around, you know, using gyms or fitness sessions or all kinds of things, art-based work. So, you know, I think it's patchy, and it's certainly been, I think the creative response has been stymied by funding cuts and high regulation, narrow policy thinking. But even when I looked at some of the current, you know, post-COVID mental health responses and plans, I see things in there like sport and leisure are important sites for, you know, people's well-being. And, you know, I've seen that for years, yet that doesn't get funded. Like, so that's an example of a kind of rhetoric that we hear, but we rarely see any investment and enactment of that through policies in an organised way. It can be quite ad hoc. So I think there's enormous potential to kind of be pushing that further. And the health system is not going to be able to cope. It's not, you know, necessarily coping now with the demand for services. So there is, you know, going to have to be a thinking of how this, a rethinking of how this can be a more distributed approach and a different kind of model that takes people's whole lives into account. So it's a big issue. I think other people might have some ideas around that as well.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I can just feel a bit of heartache about the things that were lost. Like, you imagine if those youth workers doing that small thing in a local town were able to build up those relationships where they would be 30 years later now, if, you know, we wouldn't maybe be going back to those loops and Headspaces taking over local services and those local relationships and where you are connected to place and so on. So thank you. I really appreciate your reflections.
So much. Well, I'm going to go to the break now. Simone, it was a real pleasure to host you, and what an amazing keynote to kick off our 2 days. Thanks again, and we'll come back in 10 minutes, I believe. I'm quickly checking my program. Yes, 10 minutes. Thanks, Simone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.